Have you ever felt unqualified for something, or is it ill-qualified? I think it's unqualified. Have you ever felt unqualified to do something, like somebody, like you had a task and you're like, yeah, I don't know how to do that. Like maybe they asked you to do something at work and you felt like you were in over your head. Or maybe you got hired for something, you're like, I don't know how to do that job, right? You know, I don't know all the details of your feeling unqualified, but there are lots of famous people who've been unqualified for the job that they had. In fact, one person goes to our church here, and I won't tell you his name because he's just kind of embarrassed by this idea, but he used to work for mission control at NASA. That's pretty intimidating. I'm going to bet just about anything when he got pulled into that job the very first day, he's like, oh my, am I in over my head? I'm just guessing, right? We've all felt that way. Famous people throughout history have felt that way. I got a list of them here. Walt Disney. He was fired from a job because he, quote, lacked imagination and had no good ideas. Swing and a miss on that guy, right? Oprah was fired because she couldn't separate her emotions from her story that she was covering. That turned out to be kind of her thing, didn't it? Right? And after performing at the Grand Ole Opry, Elvis was told by the concert hall manager that he should probably just go back to driving a truck in Memphis. And Einstein, he didn't talk until he was 4 and he didn't read until he was 7. Can we just fast forward to the end of the story? It turned out okay. He might have been a little late bloomer, but he made it okay. When Marilyn Monroe started her modeling career, she was told by agents that she'd probably better consider a career as a secretary. Steven Spielberg was rejected from the University of Southern California School of Theater, Film, and Television 3 times. Steven Spielberg, right? That's crazy when you think about it. Stephen King, his first book and the most heralded one, Carrie, was rejected by publishers 30 times. Man, it's easy to feel unqualified, isn't it? Those guys all felt unqualified. I felt unqualified. You felt unqualified. Most of the time when there's a task in front of me that I don't feel qualified to do, I don't know about you, but I consult the Holy Spirit at youtube.com, right? I go find some YouTube video because when the car's not running right, I can figure out what's wrong on YouTube, right? If there's something missing that's not going well and like the house needs to be fixed, a faucet or a toilet, I can figure it out on YouTube, right? If the foundation's cracked, well, maybe there's a limit to YouTube, right? But we can figure out pretty much anything these days, become qualified for it by watching a couple of videos on YouTube. But I want us to get something, and this is what we're talking about during this series, is that we've all felt unqualified. We've all felt unqualified, and when we talk about being an everyday hero, it makes us even feel more unqualified. We don't feel like we measure up, like we don't feel like we've got what it takes. We feel like maybe you're talking to the guy behind me, or the person next to me. But you can't possibly be thinking that I'm called to be an everyday hero. But I want you to know something. That couldn't be further from the truth because I'm talking to you. God has called every single one of us to be everyday heroes for the cause of the gospel. He's got a mission in mind for you and for me. And I want us to understand something. It's what we've been talking about this whole time, is that God calls unusual suspects to be everyday heroes. A couple weeks ago, we talked about Lois and Eunice and their influence on their son and grandson, Timothy. Last week, we talked about Zacchaeus and how that unbelievably unique person who was hated and extremely small found his way into this unbelievable love that Jesus had for him. And what is crazy about it is that the stories just abound because Scripture is chock full of unusual suspects that God calls to be everyday heroes. In fact, it's the normal way that he does things. He uses unqualified people. Now, where we're going to land today, I want to make sure that you understand is not just an everyday hero. This person's an everyday heroine, not an everyday heroin user. This person is a lady. And God has used ladies, women throughout history to do unbelievable things. This particular woman, her name is Lydia. She lived in a city called Philippi. And if it weren't for Lydia, if it weren't for the catalytic way that God used Lydia, there wouldn't be a church at Philippi. There wouldn't be followers of Jesus that happened at Philippi. And there wouldn't be a book of Philippians in the Bible because God used Lydia to do unbelievable things in her story. But to catch up with it, we're going to have to kind of get used to the cast of characters. The first person you got to know about in this series, like just kind of the cast of people on the stage, is Paul. You might recognize his name. He wrote most of the New Testament. Paul used to hate Christians, and then he came face to face with Jesus on the road to Damascus and made a 180-degree turn in his life. He went from town to town at the time persecuting Christians, and he changed the agenda. We pick up with him here in the book of Acts, where he's on a missionary journey, a totally different kind of journey. Instead of a mission to defeat Christians, he's going city to city, just telling people about Jesus. Paul is a key player in this story. The other person, the second guy, is his buddy Silas. Silas is his partner in ministry. He's his right-hand man. He's like his chief of staff. He's the man, the road manager. He's the guy who gets things done. He and Paul are partners on these missionary journeys. Silas is on this story. And we talked about Lois and Eunice a couple weeks ago. The third person in this story, the third character that's in this group, is Timothy. He's that young and intelligent and gifted man who Lois and Eunice cared for and invested faith in. And now he's out here with Paul and Silas on the road telling people about Jesus, making a difference in the world around him. And the fourth person is a person who wrote the book of Luke. His name is Luke. He's a doctor, and he's hanging out with these guys. And he kind of, in this one, is serving as the journalist. Because the book of Acts that Luke wrote, the Acts of the Apostles in kind of a more disciplined, like a more formal way. When he writes the book of Acts, he's writing it to kind of chronicle the beginning of the church. That's right, like the beginning of journey. We exist today as a church, a gathering of followers of Jesus, because Luke and Silas and Paul and Timothy all work city to city to begin the church. And this story kind of unfolds city to city where they're passing on this unbelievable news of Jesus who changes lives. So the story kind of picks up in Acts chapter 16. It says, "We boarded a boat at Troas and sailed straight across the islands of," I don't know what that word is, "and the next day landed at Neapolis, and from there we reached Philippi, a major city that is the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony." And we stayed there several days. Remember back in the day, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, when we had that thing called MapQuest? Remember MapQuest directions? We didn't have GPS back then. If you're under like 30, you're like, what on earth did you do before GPS? You know what we used to do? Get lost. That's what we did. But then we got to a place where we could print out MapQuest directions, and it would just be like pieces of real paper that you printed out, and it would say go 4.8 miles on that road, and then at the stoplight turn left. And it was just like GPS now, but like we didn't have the global positioning. It was just a map system, right? We'd print out those things. That's what it sounded like to me. When they boarded a boat from one place and they sailed across from that place and they went to the next day, they went to this place and they reached this place. What's important here isn't so much just the information. Now, these are important things. This helps us lend credibility to the story when we put these cities down. We can see it on a map. But rather than bore you with a map, I want you to see what they were following. They weren't following a map. They weren't following a plan. They weren't following directions. They were following the Holy Spirit. And what was crazy about it is when they landed at this place called Philippi, they got there and probably immediately thought, we're in the wrong place. But this is not the right place. Normally when they would land at a city, the first thing they would do is go find a synagogue. Synagogue's a gathering of Hebrew men and some of their families, and it would be a place where they would be together and they would worship, they would read scripture, they would pray together, they would seek God. And normally a synagogue is where kind of Paul played his best cards. He had his little stump speech, right? He'd go in because he was a teacher of the law. He was a Pharisee. He knew things. He was connected. He knew people who knew people who knew people, had a reputation. And so when he came into a city, found a synagogue, they would let him speak. And he would stand up and he would tell people about the way. He wouldn't tell people about Christianity. He would tell people about Jesus. Christianity didn't exist at the time. What existed was the way. These people who were following the way of Jesus. But he got to Philippi and there was no like gathering of men. There was no synagogue. You know what that means? It takes 10 men, 10 followers of the Hebrew faith to make a synagogue. That means that there weren't 10 believers. There weren't 10 men in the whole city of Philippi who believed in this following of this Hebrew faith. So Paul, when he got there following this kind of path, he had to be feeling the leading of the Spirit and landed at Philippi. And I would get there if I were you, if I were Paul, we would have walked in and said, man, we got to find a city where our shtick works, right? Because our deal is we kind of come in, we talk to the Hebrew people, we talk at the synagogue, we spread the news of Jesus, and we go on to the next place. But he shows up here, led by Spirit, to this moment where they get in there and there's nobody there. And they expected to find people. And on the Sabbath, we went a little way outside of the city to the riverbank where we thought people would be meeting for prayer. And we sat down there to speak with some women who had gathered there. Now that's an unlikely story. Unlikely story because they thought that, hey, there'll be some people down by the river. Like that's where the church will gather. That's where the synagogue will be. And they go down there expecting to find people. And what did they find? They found women. They found women who weren't particularly seeking the same questions that they were answering, right? They found just a group of women interested in faith. You know what's crazy about this story is there's a lot in here. That Paul is he's not unaware of the biblical model for how God designed the family. In fact, let me just point this out to you. Paul wrote the biblical model. Like all the things that we say about what the roles of men and women are and how that works and how God designed the family, Paul was well aware of them because Paul wrote them. But he's not unaware of these things, but he sees these women and he knows that the most important thing is that they find and follow Jesus because these women are gathered praying. But you know what he doesn't do? He doesn't make an assumption. What's important to me is I would see a group of women praying. I'd be, oh, they're good. We'll go tell somebody else who's not praying, right? But he doesn't make an assumptions, and that's important for us. We need to never make assumptions when it comes to faith. Just because somebody says the right things doesn't mean that they're a follower of Jesus. Just because somebody you know has a Christian t-shirt that says faith over fear doesn't mean that they know and follow Jesus. Just because somebody listens to Christian music or loves some worship music doesn't mean that they're a worshiper of Jesus. So you and I, in our efforts to reach out and love and care for people, help them take their next step toward Jesus, never make assumptions when it comes to faith. There's far too much at stake. And that's important for us to get. But what's most important, what's critical in this story is Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke, they walk up to talk to these ladies because they're seeking God. They don't know what they're seeking God for, but they're like, I want to find God. I want to find faith. And Paul and Timothy and Luke and Silas walk up to him and they begin to have this conversation and say, listen, I want you to know something. I want you to find what you're looking for. And they found this lady named Lydia. One of the ladies there was Lydia from Thyatira. She was a merchant of expensive purple cloth who worshiped God. Now I want you to catch a couple of things that are important about Lydia. Lydia is a leader. She is a purveyor of purple cloth, right? She's a seller of fine purple cloth. Now, purple was an interesting dye because it wasn't easy to make. You couldn't just go get purple dye. It had to be made from the crushing of some certain snails found in a certain region. And so this process of making it was expensive and difficult. And so because it was expensive to make the dye, it was expensive to make the garments. Because it was expensive to make the garments, it was expensive to buy the garments. Because it was expensive to buy the garments, only the very best, only the very richest people had purple garments. And she was a seller of purple garments. That meant that she was uniquely positioned to be a significant influence in the city of Philippi. But she also had a lot to lose too, didn't she? I mean, she's positioned to be a significant influence in the city of Philippi. But if people didn't like what she had to say, then she had a lot to lose in the city of Philippi. But the key piece here is that she worshiped God. Didn't mean that she followed Jesus. Didn't mean that she knew that Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life. It didn't mean that she understood all of what she worshiped, but she wanted to know God. And she was down at this riverbank praying and just seeking. And now they're at this riverbank because there had to be some place to be ceremonially cleansed. And so they would, all kinds of faith stories have this deal where there's a ceremonial cleansing in it. And what's important about it is that Jesus sent Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke to this place, and Lydia heard the gospel message. And what's most important about Lydia and what makes her a hero first in the story is that Lydia responded to Jesus. The next verses are just kind of unfold and say what happened is that because she heard this gospel message, she opened her heart to Jesus, and she and her household were immediately baptized. Paul was like, let me tell you about Jesus. This God you're seeking, let me tell you about him. He came in person. He gave his life so that you and I could have life. And he is the way, the truth, and the life. This Jesus will change your name. You're looking for hope, and hope has a name. It's named Jesus. And Jesus wants you to respond to him. And she says, I'm in, right? Because her heart was open, because she was listening. We'll look at it in a minute. And she responded, and she said, I'm in all the way. And she was immediately baptized. Her and her whole family. She led her family in faith. And I want us to get this because it's important that every single time throughout the book of Acts, and remember what we said, the book of Acts is the chronicle or this journal of the beginning of us as a church. Every single time you see somebody place their faith in Jesus, you immediately see baptism. Every time you see faith, baptism, faith, and baptism. And if you were to look out the story of the beginning of the church, you'd find out that baptism is the normative way to express faith in Jesus. There's nothing special about the water of baptism. There is, however, something special about obedience. There's nothing special about the waters of baptism, but there is, however, something special about the issue of obedience. And that's such an important thing for you and I to get, is that Lydia responded to Jesus, and she was willing to get baptized. So here's the question for you. You might be in this deal where you're like, man, last week I took communion for the first time. Last week I believed. Or this week you're starting to go, man, I want to find and follow Jesus. I've been asking questions. Or maybe 6 weeks ago you started this faith journey, and now you're starting to ask this question. Maybe you're wondering, did I get saved did I get to spend eternity with God when I raised my hand? Or when I prayed a prayer, or when I first believed, or when I get baptized? You know what I'd answer that question? I don't know. Here's what I'd say, is that it's important to believe. It's important to pray. It's important to express your faith. It's important to be baptized. And here's what I would say, there's no reason to not do all of them. Express faith by all means. Believe it in your heart. Accept it. Confess it with your mouth. And by all means, be baptized. There's no question. Why is it we would hold out and go, well, let me just figure all the details out first? Jesus commanded, and it was good enough for him. Why isn't it good enough for me? It's an important thing because baptism, according to Acts, is the normative way to express faith in Jesus. Now, Lydia didn't just respond to Jesus. Lydia did something else that's profound. Lydia owned the spiritual direction of her household. You know what's crazy about it? We don't really know what's up with Lydia's husband. There's a lot of scholarly debate about it. Maybe she was widowed. That's possible. Maybe she's just influential and he's not as influential. Maybe her manufacturing and selling of fine purple cloths made her the successful one. We don't know all the details. We don't know if she's divorced. We don't know her story. But what we do know is that it says that her and her family were baptized. She didn't force her children, her family to be baptized. She led them toward Jesus. And that's an important thing, is that Lydia owned the spiritual direction of her family. That's an important reason why she's a hero. And ladies and gentlemen, dads and moms, right, all of us, we have this opportunity as aunts or uncles or friends to own the spiritual direction of our families. Remember a couple weeks ago, I had these marbles and made some of you cry when we talked about it, but 936 marbles. 936 weekends from the time your child is born until they graduate high school. We, as a family, are now officially have lost our marbles, right? Our last daughter has graduated high school, 936 of them. You know what's crazy about it is that we use these 936 marbles to teach them how to walk. We teach them how to talk, right? We teach them math. We'll teach them English. We'll use these 936 weeks. We'll use that to teach them how to clean up their room. We'll expect them to learn how to learn together, right? We'll expect all those things. We'll teach them how to play baseball in these 936 weeks. What's crazy about it is we'll teach them how to play a game. We'll force them into stuff. We'll get them immersed in it. We'll cheer and get excited about their accomplishments on a ball field or on a court or in some other way. But what we do all the time when it comes to faith is we outsource it. Now listen, I want you to know something. I love our Journey Kids families. I love our Journey Kids volunteers and our 412 students volunteers. They have made a huge difference in our kids' lives. Sheila and I will be eternally grateful for all of you who invested in our 3 girls. But understand something, we had 936 weeks. You know what we have with our kids and our Journey Kids? If you show up 40 weekends out of the year, we have this. We have 40 hours. They have another 100 hours, right? They have 24 hours in a day. We get them for 1 hour a week. And so understand something. As valuable as a resource as our small group leaders are, as amazing as our second grade and our Club 45 volunteers and our garage volunteers and our nursery workers and our small group, as amazing as they are absolutely amazing, and they have been a huge resource for Sheila and I. But we need to understand something. You can't outsource discipleship. That's a crucial piece, because look at what happened in Lydia's story. It says this: as she listened to us, as she listened to Paul and Silas and Luke and Timothy, the Lord opened her heart and she accepted what Paul was saying. She and her household were baptized, and she asked us to be her guests. She was compelled, right? She was changed. And she said, listen, I need to know something. I need to know that it's not just me understanding this, that I was going to share it with my family. And I just want you to understand that you don't have to own your family, your home, to own the spiritual direction of your household. Let me say that again. You don't have to own your home. You don't have to be the person who's on the mortgage to own the spiritual direction of your household. And you don't have to be the mom or the dad. You could be a stepdad. You could be a stepmom. You could be an uncle or an aunt. You could be a friend, a family friend. But own the spiritual direction of your household, the people in your influence. You don't have to be married or have kids in your life at all. It could be your roommates. You could own the spiritual direction. You could own the responsibility of the spiritual direction of your household. So let me just ask you that. How are you doing at exactly that question? How are you doing at owning the spiritual direction of your household? It says that if you agree that I'm a true believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay with me at my home. And she urged us until we agreed. That's an interesting phrase. I mean, Sheila has urged me until I agreed a number of times, right? I'm not going to say what we usually call that, but she urged them until they finally agreed. She won by attrition. And what's crazy about the story is that they stayed with her a couple of days and then they went on. And they went on from there and they shared the story of Jesus in other places. In fact, they made some people mad when they did it. They shared the story of Jesus, and they got onto these people who were making money off of a little girl, and they were arrested and they were put in jail. And Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke were put into jail, and they just prayed and worshiped the whole time, and God performed a miracle and shook the walls of the jail until they fell down. And this jailer woke up and he said, hey, where's all the prisoners? He thought for sure they had escaped, and he was about ready to kill himself when Paul said, no, we're right here. We haven't gone anywhere. That Philippian jailer decided in that moment to give his life to Jesus. He and his family were baptized. It was an unbelievable movement of God and a miracle, and then they were free. And you know what they did next? This is such a powerful, important thing. When Paul and Silas left the prison, they returned to the home of Lydia. There they met with the believers and encouraged them once more. And then they left town. What had happened? When Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke showed up into Philippi, there were nobody. Just some women down by the water. And there was nobody there, right? And all of a sudden, they go down to the river and they share this unbelievable, life-changing truth with Lydia. And then they stay at her house for a few days. And then they go get arrested. Some time passes. And as they come back, look what happens. They met with the believers and encouraged them again. What had happened between the first meeting with Lydia and the last meeting with Lydia before they left town is that Lydia had leveraged everything that she had to spread the news. It's one of the reasons I believe that Lydia is an everyday hero, the same reason that God believes that you could be an everyday hero, is Lydia used what she had to spread the news. She leveraged her influence, her resources, to spread the good news of Jesus. It's the same thing that Jesus calls us to do. Like to be like the good shepherd who leaves the 99 and go chases the one. She didn't hold in what she had. She said, I want to utilize, I want to leverage the things that God has given me to tell people about him. And because of that, then when they came back, they were believers. Because of that, when Paul wrote back, there was a church gathered at Philippi. And because there's a church gathered at Philippi, you and I have the book of Philippians. And because the book of Philippians has encouraged the church, you and I have Journey Church to help people take their next step toward Jesus. So the question that really is on us today is, will you and I be an everyday hero? Will we just be like Lydia? Will we respond to Jesus? Will you and I respond to Jesus and own the spiritual direction of our household? And will you and I leverage or use what we have to spread the news? It's really a very simple question. God has called every one of us to be everyday heroes. Now go live like it.